Hello, I am back. Chapter 27 of To Kill a Mockingbird. Chapter 26. It was a little bit of a long one. Yeah, a little long, but it was more, or well, I read so many last night, I might be confused, but no, it was a real short one. And what it was about was the fact that Jem and Scout, I have a little bit of a headache, so bear with me. Jem and Scout are steadily growing apart in age, and the differences between them are becoming more and more apparent. Scout is basically much more left with the women folk now, and a little bit more interested, maybe, in being a little bit more ladylike and all that type of thing. And then the last end of it was when Scout and Jim are talking about Hitler. He's just coming into, being known in the mid-30s, about, people just now getting to know about Hitler's rising in power, and, excuse me, and that's about it. So, chapter 27. Things did settle down after a fashion, as Atticus said they would. By the middle of October, only two small things out of the ordinary happened to make them citizens. No, there were three things, and they did not directly concern us, the Finches, but in a way they did. The first thing was that Mr. Bob Yule acquired and lost a job in a matter of days, and probably made himself unique in the annals of the 1930s. He was the only man I ever heard of who was fired from the WPA for laziness. I suppose his brief burst of fame brought on a briefer burst of industry, but his job lasted only as long as his notoriety. Mr. Yule found himself as forgotten as Tom Robinson. Thereafter, he resumed his regular weekly appearances at the welfare office for his check, and received it with no grace amid obscure mutterings that the bastards who thought they run this town wouldn't permit an honest man to make a living. Ruth Jones, the welfare lady, said Mr. Yule openly accused Atticus of getting his job. She was upset enough to walk down to Atticus's office and tell him about it. Atticus told Miss Ruth not to fret, that if Bob Yule wanted to discuss Atticus's getting his job, he knew the way to the office. The second thing happened to Judge Taylor. Judge Taylor was not a Sunday night churchgoer. Mrs. Taylor was. Judge Taylor savored a Sunday night hour alone in his big house, and church time found him holed up in his study reading the writings of Bob Taylor, no kin, but the judge would have been proud to have claimed it. One Sunday night, lost in fruity metaphors and florid diction, Judge Taylor's attention was wrenched from the page by an irritating scratching noise. "Hush," he said to Ann Taylor, his fat, nondescript dog. Then he realized he was speaking to an empty room. The scratching noise was coming from the rear of the house. Judge Taylor climbed to the back porch to let Ann out, and found the screen door swinging open. A shadow on the corner of the house caught his eye, and that was all he saw of his visitor. Mrs. Taylor came home from church to find her husband in his chair, lost in the writings of Bob Taylor with a shotgun across his lap. The third thing happened to Helen Robinson, Tom's widow. If Mr. Yule was as forgotten as Tom Robinson was as forgotten as Boo Radley. But Tom was not forgotten by his employer, Mr. Link Deas. Mr. Link Deas made a job for Helen. He didn't really need her, but he said he felt right bad about the way things had turned out. I never knew who took care of her children while Helen was away. Calpurnia said it was hard on Helen, because she had to walk nearly a mile out of her way to avoid the Yules, who, according to Helen, chunked at her the first time she tried to use the public road. Mr. Link Deas eventually received the impression that Helen was coming to work each morning from the wrong direction, and dragged the reason out of her. "Just let it be, Mr. Link, please, sir," Helen begged. "The hell I will," said Mr. Link. Told her to come by his store that afternoon before she left. She did, and Mr. Link closed his store, put his hat firmly on his head, and walked Helen home. He walked her the short way, by the Yules. On his way back, Mr. Link stopped at the crazy gate. "You!" he called. "I say, you!" The windows, normally packed with children, were empty. "I know every last one of you's in there, a-laying on the floor. Now hear me, Bob Yule. If I hear one more peep out of my girl Helen about not being able to walk this road, I'll have you in jail before sundown." Mr. Link spat in the dust and walked home. Helen went to work next morning and used the public road. Nobody chunked at her. But when she was a few yards beyond the Yule house, she looked around and saw Mr. Yule walking behind her. She turned and walked on, and Mr. Yule kept the same distance behind her until she reached Mr. Link Deas' house. All the way to the house, Helen said, she heard a soft voice behind her, crooning foul words. Thoroughly frightened, she telephoned Mr. Link at his store, which was not too far from his house. As Mr. Link came out of his store, he saw Mr. Yule leaning on the fence. Mr. Yule said, "Don't you look at me, Link Deas, like I was dirt. I ain't jumped you. First thing you can do, Yule, is get your stinking carcass off my property. You're leaning on it, and I can't afford fresh paint for it. Second thing you can do is stay away from my cook, or I'll have you up for assault. I ain't touched her, Link Deas, and I ain't about to go with no nigger. You don't have to touch her. All you have to do is make her afraid. And if assault ain't enough to keep you locked up a while, I'll get you in on the ladies' law. So get out of my sight. If you don't think I mean it, you just bother that girl again." Mr. Yule evidently thought he meant it, for Helen reported no further trouble. "I don't like it, Atticus. I don't like it at all," was Aunt Alexandra's assessment of these events. "That man seems to have a permanent running grudge against everybody connected with that case. I know how that kind are about paying off grudges, but I don't understand why he should harbor one. He had his way in court, didn't he?" "I think I understand," said Atticus. "It might be because he knows in his heart that very few people in Macomb really believed his and Mayella's yarns. He thought he'd be a hero, but all he got for his pain was, okay, we'll convict this Negro, but get back to your dump. He's had his fling with about everybody now, so he ought to be satisfied. He'll settle down when the weather changes." "But why should he try to burgle John Taylor's house? He obviously didn't know John was home, or he wouldn't have tried. Only lights John shows on Sunday nights are on the front porch, and back in his den. You don't know if Bob Yule cut that screen. You don't know who did it," said Atticus. "But I can guess. I've proved him a liar, but John made him look like a fool. All the time Yule was on the stand, I couldn't dare look at John and keep a straight face. John looked at him as if he were a three-legged chicken or a square egg. Don't tell me judges don't try to prejudice juries," Atticus chuckled. By the end of October, our lives had become the familiar routine of school, play, and study. Jim seemed to have put out of his mind whatever it was he wanted to forget, and our classmates mercifully let us forget our father's eccentricities. Cecil Jacobs asked me one time if Atticus was a radical. When I asked Atticus, Atticus was so amused I was rather annoyed, but he said he wasn't laughing at me. He said, "You tell Cecil I'm about as radical as Cotton Tom Heflin." Aunt Alexandra was thriving. Miss Maudie must have silenced the whole missionary society at one blow, for Auntie Agreed ruled that roost. Her refreshments grew even more delicious. I learned more about the poor Maroonah's social life from listening to Miss Merriweather. They had so little sense of family that the whole tribe was one big family. A child had so many fathers as there were men in the community, as many mothers as there were women. J. Grimes Everett was doing his utmost to change the state of affairs and desperately needed our prayers. Macomb was itself again, precisely the same as last year said, and the year before that, with only two minor changes. Firstly, people had removed from their store windows and automobiles the stickers that said, "NRA, we do our part." And I asked Atticus why, and he said it was because the National Recovery Act was dead. I asked who killed it, and he said 9 old men. The second change in Macomb since last year was not one of national significance. Until then, Halloween in Macomb was a completely unorganized affair. Each child did what he wanted to do, with assistance from other children if there was anything to be moved, such as placing a light buggy on top of a livery stable. But parents thought things went too far last year, when the peace of Miss Tootie and Miss Fruity was shattered. Mrs. Tootie and Fruity Barber were maiden ladies, sisters, who lived together in the only Macomb residence boasting a cellar. The Barber ladies were rumored to be Republicans, having migrated from Clanton, Alabama in 1911. Their ways were strange to us, and why they wanted a cellar, nobody knew. But they wanted one, and they dug one, and they spent the rest of their lives chasing generations of children out of it. Mrs. Tootie and Fruity, their names were Sarah and Frances, aside from their Yankee ways, was both deaf. Miss Tootie denied it and lived in a world of silence, but Miss Fruity, not about to miss anything, employed an ear trumpet so enormous that Jim declared it was a loudspeaker from one of those dog Victrolas. With these facts in mind and Halloween at hand, some wicked children had waited until the Mrs. Barber were thoroughly asleep, slipped into their living room, nobody but the Radleys locked up at night, stealthily made away with every stick of furniture therein, and hid it in their own cellar. I deny having taken part in such a thing. "I heard 'em," was the cry that awoke the Mrs. Barber's neighbors at dawn next morning. "Heard 'em driving a truck up in the door. Stomped around like horses. They're in New Orleans by now." Miss Tootie was sure those traveling fur sellers who came through town 2 days ago had purloined all their furniture. "Dark they were," she said. "Syrians." Mr. Heck Tate was summoned. He surveyed the area and said he thought it was a local job. Miss Fruity said she'd known a Macomb voice anywhere, and there were no Macomb voices in that parlor last night. Rolling their R's all over her premises they were. Nothing less than the bloodhounds must be used to locate their furniture, Miss Tootie insisted, so Mr. Tate was obliged to go 10 miles out the road, round up the county hounds, and put 'em on the trail. Mr. Tate started 'em off at Miss Barber's front steps, but all they did was run around to the back of the house and howl at the cellar door. When Mr. Tate set 'em in motion 3 times, he finally guessed the truth. By noontime that day, there was not a barefooted child to be seen in Macomb, and nobody took off his shoes until the hounds was returned. So the Macomb lady said things would be different this year. The high school auditorium would be open. There'd be a pageant for the grown-ups, apple bobbing, taffy pulling, pinning the tail on the donkey for the children, and there'd be also a prize of 25 cents for the best Halloween costume created by the wearer. Jim and I both groaned. Not that we'd ever done anything, it was the principle of the thing. Jim considered himself too old for Halloween anyways. He said he wouldn't be caught anywhere near the high school at something like that. Oh well, I thought, Atticus would take me. I soon learned, however, that my services would be required on stage that evening. Mrs. Grace Merriweather had composed an original pageant entitled Macomb County ad Astra per Aspera, and I was to be a ham. She thought it would be adorable if some of the children were costumed to represent the county's agricultural products. Cecil Jacobs would be dressed up to look like a cow, Agnes Boone would make a lovely butterbean, another child would be a peanut, and on down the line until Miss Merriweather's imagination and the supply of children was exhausted. Our only duties, as far as I could gather from our 2 rehearsals, was to enter from stage left as Miss Merriweather, not only the author but the narrator identified us, and when she called out pork, that was my cue, and then the assembled company would sing, Macomb County, we will aye be true to thee, as the grand finale, and Miss Merriweather would mount the stage with the state flag. My costume was not much of a problem. Miss Crenshaw, the local seamstress, had such an imagination as Miss Merriweather. Miss Crenshaw took some chicken wire and bent it onto the shape of a cured ham. This she covered with brown cloth and painted it to resemble the original. I could duck under, and someone would pull the contraption over my head. It came almost to my knees. Miss Crenshaw thoughtfully left 2 peepholes for me. She did a fine job. Jim said I looked exactly like a ham with legs. There were several discomforts, though. It was hot, it was a very close fit. If my nose itched, I could not scratch it, and once inside, I could not get out of it alone. When Halloween came, I assumed that the whole family would be present to watch me perform, but I was disappointed. Atticus said, as tactfully as he could, that he just didn't think he could stand a pageant tonight. He was all in. He had been in Montgomery for a week, and had come home late that afternoon. He thought Jim might escort me if I asked him. Aunt Alexandra said she just had to go to bed early. She'd been decorating the stage all afternoon and was worn out. She stopped short in the middle of her sentence. She closed her mouth, and then opened it to say something, but no words came. "What's the matter, Auntie?" I asked. "Oh, nothing, nothing," she said. "Somebody just walked over my grave." She put away from whatever it was that gave her a pinprick of apprehension and suggested that I give the family a preview in the living room. So Jim squeezed me into my costume, stood at the living room door, called out, "Pork!" exactly as Miss Merriweather would have done, and I marched in. Atticus and Aunt Alexandra were delighted. I repeated my part for Calpurnia in the kitchen, and she said I was wonderful. I wanted to go across the street to show Miss Maudie, but Jim said she'd probably be at the pageant anyways. After that, it didn't matter whether they went or not.